Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be with you. The goal of my session is to talk about two very specific blocks to potentially poor decisions and what the best investors do to overcome them. The goal of the session, too, is to be very practical. I hope when you go back to your desks, you'll immediately be able to implement some of these ideas and ultimately make better decisions. Adam Grant mentioned earlier today the Good Judgment Project, a project at the University of Pennsylvania on forecasting. It turns out they did something very interesting. When forecasters volunteered to participate in their project, they either in control gave them no training or they gave them some training. And the question was, did the training make them better at making better forecasts? And the answer to that was yes. But it's actually somewhat qualified. There are different flavors of training that have different impacts. The first is just giving people information about heuristics and biases. And it turns out, you could do a couple experiments, it turns out it's really fun for people, they enjoy it, and then they walk back to their desk and they do exactly what they were doing before. So it doesn't change any behavior. The two that we want to focus on is process, so very specific tools and techniques we can work on to uncover biases, and then finally giving people feedback, certainly a theme that's come through a lot today. There is a little bit on format, so how you can reframe problems. I'll give you one example that's a little bit in that flavor, but we're going to focus mostly on process and feedback. So let's jump into this. I think the first very big barrier to making good decisions is the notion of overconfidence, and I think the best investors are very good at overcoming this. Now, it turns out overconfidence, which is often considered the root of all problems, comes again in different varieties. The first, I'll say at the very bottom, is this idea of overplacement. People think of themselves as better than they are versus others. So you've all heard this, I'm above average driver, or my sense of humor is better than 90% of other people. The other is the idea of overestimation, which people absolutely think they're better at certain tasks, so I can make this 7-foot putter or whatever it is. So overplacement. But the one that we're most interested in, I think, is this concept of over-precision. We actually think we understand the future better than we actually do. And I think the really good investors are those that can combat and overcome that. Let me give you an example of how this works. This is a sort of a test of calibration, in some degree a test of overconfidence. By the way, the URL is down there. If you can't find it or to see it, just let me know. It's a very fun exercise to do in your own organization or with your loved ones. It's 50 true-false questions, some of which you'll know the answer to, many of which you will not know the answer to. So you answer true-false, and then you give a confidence. 100% means I know the answer to this question. 50% means I don't know the answer, and I'm guessing. Right? So this is the basic setup. Now, we've had about 20,000 people do this exercise, and this is the scatter plot of all the responses. By the way, I do want to mention two, and I'm sure they're guys. I'm going to mention two guys that are my two favorite dots. The one is the upper right-hand corner, which is 100% correct and 100% confident. So this guy Googled everyone, and the second guy that was even better is in the bottom right-hand corner. He is 35% correct and 95% confident. You just said true, 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 true. You do better than that guy did. Now, the goal of this exercise is not to be right about every question. If you can be right, that's great. But the goal of the exercise, as you might imagine, is to know what you know and to know what you don't know. The goal of the exercise is to lie as close to the 45-degree angle line as possible. Now, even people in the very back of the room can probably see this. When I give you the numbers, you won't be shocked to hear this. The average confidence is 70%, and the average correct is about 60%. People are 10 percentage points overconfident in their own judgments. Now, let's unpack that a little bit to see if there's anything interesting. Well, the first is the distribution of overconfidence versus underconfidence. By the way, I mentioned this 10% overconfidence. It turns out the standard deviation is also 10, so it's a beautiful shaped Bell distribution when you have this many people. And about 82 or 83% of people are overconfident. That's something we see very consistently. By the way, as a side note, and I'm glad you're all sitting to hear this information, men tend to be more overconfident than women. And young men tend to be more confident than older men, so there's some patterns there. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. It turns out that how do people answer when they're doing this exercise, right? So again, you're getting 50% means I can guess, so I don't know the answer, to 100%. So it turns out when people don't know the answer, they know they don't know the answer, and they answer they don't know the answer. So they're actually about 40% of the answers is I don't know, which is fine. What's fascinating is the second most common response is, I've got this. I'm 100% sure I know the answer. So between I have no idea what's going on and I know the answer is about 2/3 of all responses. And people are very sparing in using those intermediate ranges. By the way, as Adam was talking about super forecasters, he alluded to this, but super forecasters are much better at updating their views and being more granular in actually setting their forecasts. Okay, so how do people do given their confidence? Well, this is the most fascinating chart. Turns out when people don't know the answer, again, they answer if they don't answer, and they're pretty well calibrated at I don't know. But as you move from left to right on this chart, you see this systematic departure from the 45-degree angle line. When people are 100% sure they know the answer, they're only right 77% of the time. When they are 90% sure, they're only right 2/3 of the time. Right? There's this yawning gap, especially in this range of I'm very sure what's going on. Howard Marks remarked about this just this morning, that this is sort of the Mark Twain thing. When you're very confident about something and you're wrong about it, this is where trouble can arise. This is also very, very important for portfolio construction concepts. By the way, there's an interesting, there's a brand new paper about this, but there's a new survey, there's a group called the Survey of Professional Forecasters that forecast economic things. So this is unemployment rates and interest rates and so forth. And they have a data set going back to 1968. So 55 or 60 years of data on this. And it's the exact same thing. They would say, what's going to happen with this thing with some sort of probability. And here again, these are professional forecasters. And here you see this exact same pattern unfold. High confidence, poor conviction. Now, why is this, what's exciting about this, on the other hand, is going back to the concept of feedback, is it turns out when people get feedback on their forecasts, they get better at it over time. So this is a picture of actually weather forecasters. The line at the bottom is actually the first year they did this. And these are large sample sizes. And then the next year, they repeated the exercise with the feedback from the first year, and you can see they got markedly better. So this should be very encouraging to all of us, that if we practice and get the feedback, we get better at this, right? But keeping track of your decisions is really crucial to this. Okay, so what's going on here? How can we improve, broadly speaking? What do the best investors do? Andy mentioned Danny Kahneman. We all mourn his loss. He was extraordinary. But one of the concepts that Danny popularized is this idea of the inside versus the outside view. See, the inside view says when I give you a problem, it could be any kind of problem, the classic way to solve this, see if this makes sense to you, is you gather lots of information, you combine it with your own experience, and then you project into the future. Right? Left-order devices, that's what we do. Information, my experience, what's going to happen in the world. The outside view, by contrast, says, I'm going to think about my problem as an instance of a larger reference class. I'm going to ask what happened when other people were in this situation before. It's a very unnatural way to think about the world, right? Because you have to leave aside your cherished information, and you have to find and appeal to the base rate. What psychologists like Kahneman have demonstrated is some combination of the inside and the outside view lead to better forecasts. Let me give you one example from the world of business. This is Peloton, right? And this is an analyst report that was written in September 2020. So please roll your mind back 3.5 years to the middle of the pandemic. They were doing great because everybody wanted to exercise while they were at home. They had just finished a blockbuster year, 2020. And the analyst wrote in his report that our base case scenario is they're going to grow revenue 30% for the next decade. And by the way, it's a very, I'm telling you, the guy's a serious model. He's got it, it's all built out. It's actually quite credible. So that's his inside view. Now, the question you are going to ask, hopefully using the Danny Kahneman mindset, is how many companies with $2 billion of turnover grew 30% a year for 10 years? And here are the data on this. I put the Peloton bike, the guy's forecast. But you can see the average is about 6%. The standard deviation is a little bit more than that. This is the guy's base case. So you might say if he's wildly optimistic, he should certainly have a scenario for that. But that certainly would not be your base case. Right? So this gives you an example of how you might temper that. There's a great quote from Danny Kahneman, by the way, which really applies to investors. He says, people who know information about their own individual circumstances feel no need effectively to appeal to the base case, the reference class to which it belongs, right? You feel like I've done the work. I don't need to know what happened in the rest of the world. When we know combining these two things is very powerful. So why do we do this? A few reasons. One is, Annie just mentioned one of them, but one is called three illusions. One is called the illusion of superiority. We tend to think of ourselves as better than those around us. By the way, why do I have a picture of Mother Teresa? 25 years ago, U.S. News and World Report did a survey of 1,000 Americans, and they said, what's the probability of going to heaven? And they talked about, like, they asked about Michael Jordan and all these people. Anyway, Mother Teresa scored 79%, which seemed a little low to me, by the way. She's now a saint, so maybe people will bump it up. But this is the best. Mother Teresa, 79. They said, you, survey answer, what is the probability you'll go to heaven? 87%. Mother Teresa, I promise you, I would not answer higher than Mother Teresa. The second is the illusion of optimism. We tend to be very optimistic about our outcomes that are important to us, and so as a consequence, we tend to overcalibrate our success. And then the illusion of control. This is good. When we deem ourselves in control of a situation, we think our odds of success are much higher than they are objectively. It turns out when they go to Las Vegas, watch people rolling dice, when they want high numbers, they throw them really hard. And when they want low numbers, they throw them very gently. Doesn't work, by the way, but just this idea of being in control of the situation. Here's the last thing I'll say on this, which you can all relate to, which is this is statistical thinking. And it turns out in the real world, what carries the day are stories. Your parents told you stories. You tell stories to your children. Stories move people. Stories teach people. Stories are memorable. Statistics are not. So this is an interesting experiment where they went to people and they said, you have a horrible disease. You have a treatment alternative. It's always 50-50. So you have that in your back pocket. And then they said, we're going to give you, or they're going to show you one of four alternatives, 30, 50, 70, or 90% probability of success. So this is, you see one of those. But the key is they paired it with a story that was positive, negative, or neutral about someone like you, right? So hopefully I'm making myself clear. Everyone's got 50-50, you're getting 30 neutral. Okay. So here, let me just draw your attention to the extremes. If you give people a positive anecdote, they select the 30% effectiveness. Now, 30 versus 50, they select it almost 8 out of 10 times. If you give them a negative anecdote, they select the 90. Now, 90 versus 50, they select it less than 4 out of 10 times. The stories swamp the statistics in people making decisions. By the way, extremely important as leaders, very important for you as you think about stocks and narratives that go around them. Let me now turn to the second major problem. This is very much involved with what Annie was just talking about. I'm going to say it's confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, as you all know, even if you struggle to make a decision, once you've made a decision, you seek information that confirms your point of view, and you discount, dismiss, or disavow information that does not support your point of view. Now, there's a very interesting point about confirmation bias. It turns out almost all the biases, heuristics, and biases that are out there that Kahneman and Tversky identified are mitigated to some degree by intelligence. So if you're a smarter person on average, you learn about them, you tend to do better. The one that's not true for is confirmation bias. This affects everybody, no matter who they are and how bright they are. 2005 was the first chance I ever had to meet Danny Kahneman. It was an extraordinary day, an extraordinary session. At the very end of it, I said, Danny, if there's one thing an investor can do to improve his or her results, what would it be? Without hesitation, he said, you must keep a journal of your decisions. Write down what you think is going to happen, why you think it's going to happen. He said, write the date and time. He said, by the way, note how you feel physically and emotionally about this. But the most important thing is, as you're expressing your variant perception, as you're expressing your view that's different than what's in the market for an investment firm specifically, he said, communicate using probabilities, not words. Because if you use words, they're going to be vague enough that you can massage them after the fact. But if it's a probability, it allows you to keep score. And here's the one thing I would say. If you're going to do a probabilistic forecast, you want 3 elements. One is an outcome that we can agree upon. Second, within a specific period of time. And then with some probability. So you might say, for example, weather is a good example. Tomorrow, there's an 80% chance it's going to rain tomorrow, right? So that would satisfy that. If you have those 3 ingredients, you are in business for doing probabilistic forecasts. Now, to give you some sense of how wild this can be, I did a survey with my older son. We put out 23 common words or phrases to a population of people, and we asked them to say, what's the associated probability you'd assign to this word or phrase? And what you can see, the answers are all over the place, especially with the cognate. Now, this is for maybe native English speakers, but the cognate possible. If you say something is possible, people interpret this in extraordinarily wide ranges. So the reason you want to avoid words like that, it's a serious possibility we'll have a recession next year or whatever it is because A, you're not going to be able to keep track of your forecast, and you're going to weasel out of it after the fact. But B, if you're communicating with someone, they may hear something very different than what you mean. And that's crucial. Now, the last aspect of this is, this came up a little bit before, but I think it's fascinating in Adam's comment. Is this guy I love. His name is Keith Stanley. He's a developmental psychologist, most recently emeritus at the University of Toronto. He's written a lot of books, but he wrote a book in 2009 called What Intelligence Tests Miss. It's not the snappiest book title of all time, but it's very descriptive of the content. And what he argues is there's this thing called IQ, and more of it tends to be better than less of it, that's fine. And there's a thing he calls RQ, rationality quotient, the ability to make good decisions. He says that's really what's important. And they're kind of on different sliders. And we all know this, right? You've all gone to school, people who did really well in school and not so well in life. And we all know people who are not very good in school, but very good at life. This is this RQ, IQ. So what is RQ all about? It turns out there are two components to it. One is called instrumental rationality, which is a fancy way of saying you can achieve your objectives given your constraints. The way we think about this in economics is the axioms utility theory. The second one's the one I think we care about, and that is this idea of called epistemic rationality. It's a fancy word of saying how accurately do your beliefs map to the world? And by the way, you woke up this morning with a certain set of beliefs of how the world works. You wandered around. Information confirmed it. Some information may have disconfirmed it. What did you do in the face of that evidence? So here's a quote from Phil Techlock, which I love, and you heard this earlier today in a different form. Beliefs are hypotheses to be tested, not treasures to be protected. The best investors take that to heart. Beliefs are hypotheses to be tested, not treasures to be protected. Let's do this together. Ready? Late in the day. Here's an example of how we might do this, right? This is an example of how this works in integrating information. So imagine, hopefully I can read this. Imagine the Zapper virus causes serious disease that occurs in 1 in every 1,000 people. Say there's a test that can detect perfectly if you have the virus, you're going to be test positive. Additionally, let's say that the test actually has a 5% false positive. So if you don't have it, it's going to say you have it 1 in every 20 times, 5% false positive. Okay, so now we choose a person at random. We know nothing about his or her medical history, and that person tests positive for the Zapper virus. What is the probability from 0 to 100% that that person has the virus? Right? So the test, 1 in 1,000, test is perfect, 5% false positive. We have someone that has the virus. What's the probability? Anybody know this one? But notice you have like these numbers in your head. It's confusing. But what you're doing is integrating various pieces of information. And the answer is just a bit under 2%. And let me explain how to come up with that very quickly in a way that's easy to reframe the problem. Let's say there are 1,000 people, we're going to test all of them. First person, we're going to test the person that has the virus. They test positive, we put them in the denominator. We're then going to test the other 999, 5% of which will test positive. We put them in the denominator. So now our denominator is 51. We said we picked one person at random, they tested positive, 1 over 51, that's your 2%. Right? When I say it that way, it's easy to follow, no? But you're integrating different pieces of information, and that's what great investors are able to do quite effortlessly. Here's the last thing. This ties together a bunch of things earlier from Adam and also from what Andy just talked about. This is something called linchpin analysis. This comes from the intelligence community. When you're looking at an investment idea, what you want to do is identify the key issues that are really important for that. For most stocks or even asset classes, 2 or 3 things tend to be important. Pinpoint the working assumptions behind that, so-called linchpin premises. Advance evidence for or against that, and this is where you can come up with things like the devil's advocate. And then any indicators or signposts, right? So the way you can do this is say, we have a variant perception, here's what we believe is going to happen, and you write it all down in advance. The key to these signposts is that kill criteria that Annie was talking about. So I know in advance, if I have a thesis that's different than the market, I should pass these signposts on the road, and if I don't, then I must change my mind about what's going on. And then last, by the way, I did this with Chat. I was very proud of myself. I did this with ChatGPT. So this is like my generative AI thing. But this is just a winding road. This is how I really envision it, that you see these signposts as you go along. And if your thesis is correct, you should anticipate seeing those signposts. And if you don't see the signposts you expect, that is an opportunity, or in fact, really a challenge to change your view. So with that, let me stop. What the best investors do is calibrate well to start. They do that primarily by appealing to base rates. And second, of course, when new information encourages you or forces you to change your mind, you should change your mind when appropriate. Thank you very much.